Hello, everyone. My name is Danielle Dionne, and today I will be presenting a talk titled Linguistic Unity and Diversity Among Asian Americans in Boston. This research is conducted by myself and Charles B. Chang out of Boston University. Here's a quick glimpse at the roadmap of this talk. Now, considerable amounts of research have been conducted on Latinx American speech communities and African American speech communities individually. And these are a few references, but this is by no means an exhaustive list of the number of studies that have been conducted on these communities. However, one population that has not been thoroughly investigated at the ethnolectal level is the Asian American community. Now, this is not to say that there have not been studies on the Asian American community at the ethnolectal level, because there have been. But the goal of the present study is to investigate the extent to which individual Asian Americans, which we've defined as citizens and or residents of the United States that are of Asian descent, residing in the Boston area, share norms for 4 linguistic features. And we'll discuss these features at length in the following slides. And it's important to note that we are using the term Asian American English for simplicity's sake, even though the goal of the present study is to shed light on the existence of this very ethnolect. Now let's explore the background of these variables. The first variable that we are looking at is R deletion. This is the process by which speakers delete R in coda position. This might occur in contexts like this.
Service.
Okay, here our speaker says service and does not delete the R in this context, but it could occur here. This is a highly salient feature of Boston English and has been noted in white working and middle class Bostonian communities. These speakers delete R at the highest rates. It was previously believed that minority populations in Boston did not produce this feature. However, recent research suggests that they do. So Black Bostonians and Latinx American Bostonians have been shown to delete R. Recent research has also shown that younger generations are deleting at significantly lower rates, suggesting a change in progress. Our second feature is another feature of New England English, and this is low back raising. This is the process by which speakers will variably raise the low back A up to open O, which you might get in a context like this.
Tops.
In the example tops. This can be traced back to as early as the 1930s in the Boston area. And production of these low back vowels, although not identical to the raising in Eastern New England, has been found to correlate with ethnic and regional identity. So Wang and Halu 2014 found that Chinese American communities in New York City and San Francisco produce low back vowels in differing ways that correlated with indexing Asianness and regional identity. L vocalization is our third feature, and this is the process by which speakers will vocalize L in coda position, as you can hear in this example.
People.
This is mentioned in perceptual accounts of Asian Americans' production of English. And it's a feature that is found importantly in minority and majority populations. So Ash 1982 investigated white speakers in Philadelphia. Durian 2008 conducted a study on Black speakers in the Columbus, Ohio area. And Halu and Starr most recently investigated this feature with Chinese Americans in the San Francisco Bay Area. And for Halu and Starr, 3rd and 4th generation Chinese Americans were found to produce vocalized L, even though they were English monolinguals, suggesting that this is not purely a result of the lack of coda L in Chinese. Our final feature, LR conflation, is the process by which speakers will merge L and R, and that might occur in a context like this.
Class.
This is largely reported in perception studies on Asian American speech production, and it is highly salient as a stereotypical feature of Asian American speech and Asian accented English. This feature has also been studied extensively in the field of second language acquisition, particularly with Japanese learners of English. Now that we have looked at the background, let's get into our research questions. So specifically, do Asian Americans living in Boston produce features associated with the New England dialect? So these are the R deletion and low back raising features we're looking at. And regardless of their specific language backgrounds, do Asian Americans living in Boston produce features associated with perceptual accounts of Asian American speech? And so these features are L vocalization and LR conflation. Now turning to our methodology. To investigate these research questions, we collected data from the sociolinguistic interviews of 8 speakers. We began data collection after the 5-minute mark, and we coded 100 tokens per participant per feature, resulting in 800 total tokens per feature. As I mentioned, we had 8 participants. Each participant has a unique label that indicates their ethnic group, sex, and self-reported English use percentage. Participants were members of one of 4 ethnic groups. So we had 2 speakers that were ethnically Chinese, 2 that were Korean, 2 that were Filipino, and 2 that were Vietnamese. And we labeled this as an ethnic group since some of our speakers were born in the US and some were not. Some of our speakers were native speakers of English and some were not. We had 5 females and 3 males in our group. Each ethnic group contained 1 male speaker and 1 female speaker, with the exception of the 2 Vietnamese participants who were both female. Overall, our speakers were generally on the younger side with an average age of 23.1 years old. And they varied in their age of arrival in the Boston area. So some speakers spent most of their years in Boston. They were born and raised here essentially, and the rest of the speakers arrived after adulthood. Crucially, these participants were selected based on their self-reported percent of English use. Each ethnic group pair consisted of a high English user and a low English user. We operationalized R deletion as tokens of coda R, and these were perceptually coded as either present or absent. And the independent variables we considered were following sound, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity. For low back raising, these consisted of tokens of open O and low back A, and they were acoustically coded using F1 and F2 frequencies. And the independent variables we looked at were preceding sound, following sound, and ethnicity. For L vocalization, these consisted of tokens of coda L, and they were perceptually coded on a 4-point scale based on Halu and Fix 2012 as either definitely consonantal, some vocalization, but more consonantal, more vocalized than consonantal, or definitely vocalized. And the independent variables we looked at were stress and ethnicity. And then finally for LR conflation, these consisted of tokens of onset L and R, and these were perceptually coded as conflated or not conflated, and the independent variables we looked at were preceding and following sound. Now to the selected results. Participants did delete R, as you can see from this visual, but this was not a site of major sociolinguistic variation for our 8 speakers. So as you can see here, their deletion rate for the speakers in the present study was about 9.4%, which is drastically different from the rates of R deletion from Black Bostonians and white Bostonians in previous research. We ran a logistic mixed effects regression model with rhotic as the response variable, following sound and ethnicity as predictor variables, and word as a random effect. And we found that following sound was not a significant predictor. Ethnicity was a significant predictor, so Chinese and Vietnamese participants delete R significantly more than the grand mean, which you can see here. Korean participants, in contrast, delete R significantly less than the grand mean. For low back raising, we fit separate linear mixed effects models for nearly normalized F1 and nearly normalized F2, and both models were best fit with vowel, previous sound, following sound, and ethnicity as fixed effects and word as random effect. Vowel type was a significant predictor for F1 and F2, showing that there are two acoustically motivated segmental categories in the data. And you can see that here, that even though there is some overlap, these two vowels are separate in the vowel space. This suggests that these vowels are not raising like white Bostonians do. Ethnicity was not a significant predictor for low back raising, and following sound was significant for both F1 and F2 models. For L vocalization, we did collapse the 4-point coding schema into a binary, so either consonant or at least some vocalization. And we ran a logistics mixed effects model with binary vocalization as the outcome variable, word as a random effect, and stress and ethnicity as predictor variables. Stress was not a significant predictor for vocalization, but ethnicity was. So Filipino participants vocalized L significantly less than the overall mean, which was quite high for these speakers. And Vietnamese speakers vocalized L significantly more than the overall mean. And for LR conflation, 0 participants conflated L or R in onset position. Certain participants did utilize different techniques when producing these liquids, and we'll talk about those in more detail in the discussion section. So moving to the discussion, as we saw in the results section, Asian Americans are not deleting R at a rate that's comparable to Caucasian Bostonians or African American Bostonians. And socioeconomic status was not balanced in the sample, so we had to exclude that from the regression model. But raw data shows that speakers with lower SES actually delete R less than the overall average, which goes against previous findings in the literature. Ethnicity differences that we found in our regression model suggest that Asian Americans do not share norms for the treatment of this feature. And a note, preliminary speech rate data does suggest that these differences in R deletion may be due, at least in part, to speech rate differences. For low back raising, as we saw with the results, Asian Americans are not raising low back A like Caucasian Bostonians. Generally, they're more conservative in their production of salient and stigmatized New England features. And this is evidenced by the fact that they are not raising low back vowels and their rate of R deletion is extremely low. The effects of liquids and nasals that we found on the F1 and F2 models are consistent with previous research. So nothing surprising there. For L vocalization, we saw high rates of this feature, and this could be attributed to the fact that it's a widespread feature. By that, I mean, it's possible that participants feel more able to produce L vocalization because there's less stigma as it relates to Asian American identity, since it's a feature that's been found in Black communities and white communities and Latinx communities around the US. We did find some ethnicity differences. So Vietnamese and Filipino speakers vocalize at significantly different rates than the grand mean. And the significantly lower rates of vocalization by Filipino participants are particularly interesting due to their socioeconomic status. Both participants self-reported as below middle class, which would be inconsistent with previous findings that have suggested that lower SES corresponds to higher rates of L vocalization, whereas we find the opposite. For LR conflation, results suggest that Asian Americans are hyper aware of stigmatized and stereotypical features, since none of them produced this feature. This is particularly interesting considering that participants CFL and VFL self-reported the percent of English use at less than 10%, especially when you consider that Vietnamese and Korean do not have LR contrasts. So we would expect at least some vocalization from those speakers. Participant CMH vocalizes onset R, for example, pronouncing require as require instead of conflating R with L. And he does conflate coda R and L when preceding another liquid. So their laptop is produced as they'll laptop. So based on these findings, future research on LR conflation should investigate liquids in multiple positions, not just onset position. Now to our conclusions. The present study aimed to better understand Asian American English in the Northeast, and we found that participants do not produce features associated with New England, but they do produce one feature associated with perceptual accounts of Asian American speech, namely L vocalization. These results suggest that Asian Americans in the present study share norms in what they do and do not produce overall, especially when we compare these speakers at large to other ethnic groups and their production of these features. This is potentially in an effort to avoid being perceived as stereotypically Bostonian and stereotypically Asian. However, our findings also suggest disunity in the treatment of sociophonetic variables within the Asian American community. So not only are these speakers participating and producing features similarly when compared to other ethnic groups, but when we look within group and categorize ethnicity in a more specific context, we find that there are differences. Overall, these findings taken together call the current operationalization of ethnolect into question, since right now an ethnolect is usually operationalized as a set of features that participants share in how they do produce them and not how they don't produce them. Future research should look at larger sample sizes to draw stronger conclusions on social effects, and should collect empirical data on language attitudes to better understand social motivations for avoiding certain features. And finally, future research should compare spontaneous speech and careful speech. I'd like to acknowledge and give a special thanks to Danny Erker and Kate Lindsay as readers for the qualifying paper that began this research project. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to the many, many research assistants that worked on the original transcription of these interviews. And finally, but most of all, I'd like to thank the speakers that participated in the sociolinguistic interviews that made this study possible. Thank you so much. And here are our references.